Yeah, it's all set, Preeti.
Thank you. We'll wait another minute or so, 6 o'clock.
We have already one Sushma Malik. She has already raised her hand. She
Some more people are waiting, Avinderji. I'm getting messages.
So I I have admitted everybody.
Okay. Indu says Artika and some other friends are waiting. Anyway, we can start, I think, now. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd especially like to welcome our guest speakers this evening and also everybody who's joined for the session. Yesterday, we had our first session on 1984 and its tragic, terrible events and the aftermath. There was a discussion centered around two books yesterday, one by Pav Singh, a journalist, writer, activist from the UK, and his book is called 1984 India's Guilty Secret. And the other one was a book by Ishmeet Kaur Chaudhary. This was an edited book with some fiction and testimonies in it. She's a writer and an educator based in Gujarat, and her book is called Black November. The session was wonderfully, very sensitively curated and moderated by Professor Ravinder Kaur of the Modern South Asian Studies Department at Copenhagen University. The discussion was heartbreaking at points, hearing testimonies from victims, having them read out, um, and also hearing about the long battles which are still going on because of their fight for justice. uh, it really was quite a searing kind of session. But I think it's necessary and it's important because we must not allow ourselves to forget. Archiving these narratives is critical. And it's important that these stories, these narratives, these personal accounts of people don't get lost, and they are preserved somewhere, they are kept alive in our memory. Today, as we go forward, we are looking at a new book. This is a book of fiction, of short stories, and our author is here, Sarabpreet Singh. The book is called Night of the Restless Spirits. I have it here because this is also an online launch of the book. And Sarabpreet, I'd like to say congratulations. And if you'd like to hold up the book, everybody doesn't have it, but if you have a copy, I have
I'd
a
be
copy,
happy to.
yes. And um, so this is also to tell you about this new book which has come out and to launch it virtually over here. It's beautifully produced, beautifully brought out by Penguin Random House, and I'm grateful to them for giving us this opportunity to have a discussion around it over here this evening. Um, the book is a set of stories, and it evokes the horror of 1984 through the stories of very ordinary people, ordinary stories of ordinary people who actually get caught up in a storm, not of their making, and much bigger than anything that they've experienced, and which in many ways destroys their lives completely. But even having said all of that, there is always hope among the despair. And while there are people who kill, there are also people who save, and there are people who support. And so the book is also dedicated to the nameless victims of the violence, as well as to the unsung heroes who responded to it with courage and compassion. That is what Saraprit writes. Um, Sarpreet Singh was here last year at Majha House, and we had a discussion around his book, The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia, which is an account of the foreigners in Maharaja Ranjit Singh's court. Uh, Sarpreet is a writer, he's a podcaster and a commentator, and he's based in the US. In conversation with him today is well-known, well-respected journalist and writer Hartosh Bal, who is political editor of The Caravan. So over to Hartosh now to take forward the conversation. And we look forward to listening to little bits read out, I hope, also from maybe one of the stories in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti. Good evening, everybody, or whatever time zone you happen to be in. I think a format would be simple. We want to talk to Sarpreet about the book. I have read the book, and I recommend that whoever has not should pick up a copy and look at it. I mentioned in a tweet that I have read a lot of material on 84 fiction and non-fiction, and this was one of the most... It's difficult to find an adjective when we are talking of an event like 84, but one of the most effective and moving works around 84, which is why I would say that everybody who could should read this. And I think today what we will do is talk through the genesis of the book, the contents of the book, hope to do it and round that up in 45 minutes, 50 minutes, throw it open to questions, have a discussion and let people have their say and let Sarpreet respond to it. And Patrikal, Sarpreet, and I just wanted to take off from our conversation, which we had a few days ago. Coincidentally, both Sarpreet and I happened to be in the same place in 1984. We were both students at BITS Pilani on campus in 1984 when these events happened. He was, as I learned a few days ago, a few years my senior. I was in my first semester. And Sarpreet, from 84 to this year, 2020, it's 36 years. It's a long arc. How did you come to write about these events now, today, 36 years after?
Sure, I'd be delighted to address that. As Hartosh mentioned, I was on campus when the events of October, November 1984 happened. And I'll be very honest with you, they didn't really have much of an impact on me then. We did have a small disturbance on the campus. There were rumors that mess lists, which indicated who lived in which room, had been circulated to some of the toughs who had entered the campus and were creating trouble. And as a precaution, a lot of Sikhs were moved to their friends' rooms for a couple of days, just out of an abundance of caution. Nothing much happened on our campus. I remember the most disappointing thing is that our cultural festival, which was very popular, had to be canceled. And that was pretty much it. Things in Pilani settled down in a couple of days. Now, remember, this was 1984, years before the internet and the plethora of information that we have at our fingertips today. In those days, the only sources of information were newspapers and, of course, television, radio, which were controlled by the government. So I was certainly aware that, Mrs. Gandhi had been assassinated, and there had been outbreaks of trouble in various places, and Sikhs had been attacked. Did it bother me a lot at that time? It didn't. I was a young man with my own preoccupations, and I have to confess that in the couple of years that followed, while I was still in India, even after I learned somewhat about what had happened, it didn't really arouse a tremendous amount of compassion in my heart, because I learned that a lot of the poorer Sikhs of Delhi in particular had been set upon and attacked. And I would say that today I'm a little ashamed of the fact that, my young self, my 20-year-old self at that time, wasn't particularly disturbed, because I didn't think of the people who had been attacked as quote unquote, my people. That's kind of the bubble that I lived in at that time. Something else that was much more insidious was going on. So I graduated from Pilani, spent the next couple of years in Pune and Mumbai working. And as somebody who had been raised out of the Punjab, I grew up in Sikkim. Until my high school, I was in Gangtok. I really didn't identify with anything Sikh culturally, and certainly not religiously, because we were an island. There were literally 2 Sikh families in Gangtok. And really, my identity as a Sikh to me at that time was more of a burden than anything else. Those of us who have grown up, away from our culture and sort of deal with the inevitable bullying that comes with being quote unquote different will understand that. The insidious part was the narrative that you encountered in mainstream media. And I remember this very, very clearly. The narrative went roughly like this. The Sikhs are an integral part of India. They are highly respected in India. Of course, they've contributed. And they've benefited tremendously from being a widely respected community in India. All of that seemed to be perfectly true, and it was. The insidious part of the narrative was that the Sikhs have more or less brought trouble upon their own heads through their actions. And of course, what was pointed to was the agitation, the Anand Prasad resolution, the agitation in the Punjab, the random violence that everybody had had enough of. So after the events of 1984 happened, June 1984 was squarely portrayed as a valiant last-ditch effort by a government to root out terrorism. October 1984 was cast as an unfortunate incident, but understandable. Understandable because a couple of Sikhs had assassinated the beloved Prime Minister of India, and what had followed was an outpouring of spontaneous rage directed at Sikhs. I bought into that narrative completely. I remember my father, who at that time used to do a lot of construction work for the military, he was a contractor for the MES, had many, many connections in the army. And one of my uncles was a brigadier in intelligence. So my father would get bits and pieces of information that were not in mainstream media, and he would share them with me. Things like, in June of 1984, the Golden Temple was not the only place of Sikh worship that was attacked. Several other gurdwaras were attacked and people were murdered there. My response? Dad, you've been brainwashed. You've been listening to the propaganda of radical Sikhs. We live in a democracy. We have a free press. If horrible stuff like that had happened, surely we would know about it. That was my response. Why? Because I completely believed the narrative that all of us were immersed in. Today, of course, we know that concurrent with Operation Blue Star was Operation Woodrose, under which 40 plus gurdwaras were similarly attacked in the Punjab. Nobody knew about this then. The October-November massacre. So I was in Delhi after the events, and some of my cousins who had been in Delhi, who had survived, talked about the fact that it was an organized massacre. They talked about the existence of this shadowy book called the Black Book, which had been put together by the PUCL and the PUDR that talked about what had happened. I wanted to get my hands on it, but I couldn't. That was that. I left India in '87 to attend graduate school in the US. And through an odd set of circumstances, which I won't get into in today's call because they're not tremendously relevant. And I suppose it wasn't completely strange because all exiles at some point in time start gravitating to their roots. And I went through a similar experience. I started learning about the Sikh faith, and as part of that, for some strange reason, I was motivated to try and learn a little bit about 1984. So I went to my university library. I was, not in the humanities. It was an engineering school. But interestingly, my library had a bunch of articles, mostly newspaper articles from the Western press that seemed to put a very different slant on what had happened in 1984 relative to what I knew. I was puzzled. My epiphany came when I was finally able to find a copy of the Black Book, which was available in the US, in 6 circles it was circulated. Its actual title is Who Are the Guilty? I also chanced upon a couple of other works that influenced me tremendously. One of them was a slim booklet put together by the Citizens of Democracy called Oppression in Punjab, under the aegis of Justice Tarkunde, who had retired from the Bombay High Court by then. These seemed to be very credible sources, and they were not Sikh sources at all. When I read the Black Book, I remember being completely shocked and devastated. The reason, what the Black Book claimed had happened was diametrically opposite to the narrative that I had been exposed to, which I had bought into completely. Then I chanced upon an article by Madhu Kishwar called Gangster Rule, which had been published in Manushi. In sharp departure from the narrative in most newspapers, she wrote an eyewitness account of what she had seen in Delhi, and it matched the Black Book 100%. So now I had two unimpeachable sources that told me that something terrible had happened in Delhi. Right around then, I stumbled upon a paper by Dr. Veena Das, who used to be, I believe, a professor at JNU at that time, somewhere in Delhi. And then later on, she moved on to Johns Hopkins University, where she was teaching at least a couple of years ago, until a couple of years ago. Dr. Das had done field research in Tilak Vihar, the so-called widow colony, where a lot of the poorest Sikhs who had survived had been resettled. In particular, she observed the children who had survived at play and heartbreakingly wrote about how they dealt with their PTSD. One of the stories that really struck me was the story of a young boy who was deaf and mute, whose father had been lynched before his eyes. And this child, unable to articulate his pain in any other manner, would mime his father's lynching with his hands and body. It was devastating to read that. Another case history that she documented was of a young girl named Ballu, whose father was doused in kerosene and set alight in front of her eyes. And this little girl, she held on to her father's hand until the last breath was in the body. The mob didn't want to harm her. They tried to pull her away. They were horrified that this child might die, but this child would not let go. So reading all of this, and we're talking about early 90s now. I'm in my mid-20s. I've finished grad school. I'm working in the Midwest. This created a tremendous amount of turmoil in my heart. And what poured out was Kultar's Mime, which is the last piece in the book, a story in verse that talks about the travails of these children and their PTSD. And then I was prompted to write a couple of other stories. The title story, Night of the Restless Spirits, was written around then. I got busy with my career, my family, got married, started to work on establishing myself in technology and business. And the few stories that I'd written sort of just sat. They sat for about 30 years almost. And my daughter, who was then a freshman in college, had been exposed to some of these, particularly the poem. And she decided to turn, much against my sage advice, because I thought it wouldn't work, she decided to turn it into a play. And to give you the short version, The play was tremendously successful. We had the modest goal of putting it up 3 or 4 times in the US, including at a Six Studies conference in Ottawa. By the time we were done, we had performed this 90 times in 6 countries. And it was truly a transformative experience in my life, I'll tell you that. The reason for that was, we were depicting something horrible. It was not ancient history. Regardless of whether we performed the play in Delhi or Mumbai or Kuala Lumpur or Vancouver or New York City, invariably in every audience, there were survivors. So there was shock, there were tears, and then there was catharsis. Again and again, we heard that people had buried their trauma deep for 30 years. We're talking about, the play was first put up in 2014, and that's when it started touring. For 30 years, an entire community had buried its trauma deep, and it was shattering to see the effect that the play had on people. It was also very moving because, with the tears and the catharsis came a tremendous amount of gratitude. I can't tell you how many people came up to us after the performances. They hugged the performers and they said, "Thank you for telling this story. It needed to be told." That was truly a turning point in my personal life. And I decided, I had already sort of backed away from my technology and business career by then. And I decided to throw myself completely into storytelling. And in the next couple of years, I wrote several additional stories that tried to examine 1984 from many different angles. Of course, bad things happened to Sikhs in 1984, quote unquote, is an important part of the book that I ended up writing, but that was only part of the story. There were many, many other stories to be told. There were stories to be told about non-Sikhs who were as horrified as anybody else at the violence and put themselves at considerable risk to save Sikh lives. There were other things to be talked about that are completely missing from history books and have indeed been buried because of various agendas. So I apologize for a long-winded answer, Hartosh, but that essentially was the genesis of this work.
Thank you, Sarpreet. And you've already spoken of Kultar's mime and the journey that took it across the world to many places and the impact it had on people. You also mentioned another story, Restless Spirits, one of the first that was written. And I mean, in that context, as you've already made clear, this is a book that sort of encompasses 84 in all its facets. We have Blue Star, we have the pogroms, the massacre of Sikhs in 84, but also that this is not a story of 84 is not just the story of Amritsar and Delhi, as even among those who know it seem to think it is. It's a story of events that went across the country and went across Punjab at that point of time. And as you mentioned, Operation Woodrose, one of the great casualties of Operation Woodrose, which has been absolutely underreported, was the attack on Gurdwara Dukh Nivaran in Patiala. And the story, if you would speak a little about it, also, as you said, it was one of the earliest stories. So maybe both the fact and fiction of the story, and if possible, read a little bit from it.
Sure. I think I'll probably start by reading a little excerpt, and then I'll talk about the story. Sure. So this is the beginning of the title story in the collection, Night of the Restless Spirits. He lies with his face down in the dust, his white beard matted, and the last few strands of hair sticky with blood. Flies buzz around the red blotches on his chest and belly. His once proud turban is now a shapeless rag dyed a new color. He can't feel the pain anymore, just a dull throbbing sensation and the sticky wetness. He wishes that his last thoughts could be different. He would like to say the Sodar once again, but he can't collect his thoughts. Each time he tries to mouth the first verse, his thoughts disintegrate into visions of violence and anger and discord. His frail old body gathers strength only to tremble in rage and lie still again. What is left of Hukam Singh lies by him. Between him and the marble wall, richly adorned in red, Hukam Singh's hands are tied behind his back with his saffron keski. The last of the old school grand raggis, he lives and breathes rags and gurbani. His voice is old and cracked, and it trembles, but every note is crystal clear, and it touches the basest of hearts. Hukam Singh's last performance is over, and what a performance. His Jodidar, who accompanies him on the tabla, has fled. But the LMGs that the Jawans carry sound like a perfectly tuned tabla. How sweetly the guns sound the kehrwa. Dinakatinakadin, dinakatinakadin. That fool of a Jodidar could never play the kehrwa right. He should have been here to listen to the soldiers. Hukam Singh's last performance is unusual. There is no Manglacharan and no alap today. There is no time spent tuning the tanpuras and the tabla. And instead of sitting down and whispering in undertones, the Sangat is uncharacteristically quiet and calm. And their heads are bare. Such disrespect. Their hands are folded, tightly folded, but oddly behind their backs. They look scared, so scared. The perfectly timed kehrwa begins on the guns, and in an unbecoming and ungainly display, the Sangat twitches and jerkily dances to the beat. And then Hukam Singh's voice joins in joyous celebration of the rhythm. His voice soars to the sky in a wonderful new rag, rising and falling in ornate gamak-embellished tans, effortlessly spanning tens of octaves, expanding until the Gurdwara, then the village, and then the entire Punjab echoes the sound of the furious melody crafted so carefully by the widow and her gleeful kehrwa pounding divisions. No longer a Sikh, but now a Sufi, dancing in agony and unholy ecstasy as each beat pierces his enormous body that is a magnet that sucks in their molten lead, and the rag comes out stronger and louder through every new mouth. It stops as suddenly as it begins. The last few notes bubble out of Hukam Singh's body and drip onto the old man's face. The Sangat has stopped its undignified, jerky dance and is sleeping, silent and sated. The widow's musicians have taken their music and have left, searching for another audience. Baba Fateh Singh wipes the pool forming before his eyes, but there is still a haze before him, making him squint. He groans as he somehow manages to raise his head a few inches off the ground. Hukam Singh's lifeless face has a grimace frozen on it, as if he had died in the middle of a particularly intricate movement of the rag. This is the start of Night of the Restless Spirits. It's a story about an old man, Fateh Singh, who's mentioned in the excerpt, who ironically survives the bullets of the British Raj in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, only to fall prey to bullets, indigenous bullets manufactured in his own country. In Jallianwala Bagh as a young boy, the old man sees an extremely strange vision which he can't explain, and he carries in his head until his last days. And then as he lies dying at Dukh Nivaran Sahib, he sees the vision again and finally makes sense of it and understands what had happened in Jallianwala Bagh and at Dukh Nivaran Sahib. So that's the title story, Night of the Restless Spirits. It really attempts to draw a line between the tremendous turmoil that the land that all of us call home has seen, not for hundreds of years, but possibly thousands of years. It's a tiny story, but it tries to sort of capture that and places the violence of 1984 within the context of all the violence that Punjab has experienced over millennia. So that's Night of the Restless Spirits.
Uh, the narrative itself, and I will come to the writing in terms of the Restless Spirits, has a very different tone thrusts than, say, some of the other pieces. Is it just the distance in time in the writing that separates it? Have you come to view things differently, or have you deliberately used different narrative styles in relating these stories?
That's an excellent question. So, The Night of the Restless Spirits, in a certain sense, is homage to three of my favorite writers. It so happens that a few years before I wrote A Night of the Restless Spirits, this is one of the earliest stories, along with Kultar's Mime, I read three books that influenced me profoundly, and all of them came from the same genre, which is magic realism. So I read Midnight's Children, which I think is absolutely magnificent, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and The Tin Drum by Gunter Grass. All of these books tackle violence in a very, very effective manner. And in fact, I'll sort of go back to my 25-year self and tell you that there's one theme that suffuses this entire book and which really, really informs a lot of work that I've done. And that is the nature of remembrance and forgetting. One of the most poignant things in 100 Years of Solitude in particular was the author's description of a massacre of banana company workers, which is terrible. As terrible as the massacre itself is the fact that a successful attempt is made to erase it from collective memory. That's the heart of this story, really. I feel that the act of remembrance is tremendously important. It goes far beyond catharsis and healing. It really is our best insurance against, making sure that the next 1984 does not happen. So yes, in that sense, this story is different. It's very much in the magic realist genre, and it probably has a much broader canvas than a lot of the other pieces in the work.
Almost, and if I be excused for using the analogy, if this draws from Marquez, I feel the later works are far closer to Vargas Llosa than Marquez in some sense. There is a realism, there is a great amount of factual research that backs up the fiction that goes into it, and which is evident to me in the story, which is the court-martial, which is about what follows the revolt in the army, which has been, again, not reported in great detail. The court-martial that takes place of the soldiers from Ramgarh who wanted to travel to the Golden Temple or to the villages in Punjab. Again, I just wanted to check what kind of research, what kind of backgrounding, what kind of testimonies went into a story like that?
So, I'm I've been, ever since I first encountered the Black Book, I've been reading whatever I can lay my hands on about 1984. Just because every time I find something new, there is, I find a new book, there's something new to discover. So the court-martial in particular, I was very aware of the Ramgarh mutiny even at that time, courtesy my dad and my uncle and his army sources. Now, this was one of the things that was really hushed up, and the reason was very obvious. The Indian Army is a widely respected institution, and throughout the decades of Indian independence, when all the other institutions have been sort of exposed as rotten to the core, this is one institution that has largely managed to preserve its integrity. It's been known for its discipline, and the notion that there would be a large scale mutiny in the army was absolutely shocking to everyone. So, when I was researching this book, I really wanted to write about the Ramgarh mutiny because, again, Hartosh, as you mentioned, this is one of the things that was absolutely buried. And quite serendipitously, I actually stumbled upon trial records of a few of the soldiers and the NCOs. And those provided a lot of the color because if you go and research Ramgarh, you'll find a little bit of information, but there's really not a whole lot of detail. I mean, this is ultimately a work of fiction. So a lot of the detail that you see in the book is essentially fictionalized, but the germ of the idea came from reading the proceedings of the court-martial, the actual court-martial of some of the soldiers.
And you do something interesting with this material. You managed to bring in both the soldiers who are being court-martialed and the officers who are carrying out the court-martial. Was that a deliberate choice, and was it something that you were consciously using to a certain effect in some ways?
Absolutely. And let me reiterate, despite the fact that I am writing about terrible, dark things, I am an optimist when it comes to the power of our shared humanity. You have to be. Otherwise, given everything that's going on around us, one would fall into really dark despair. So I wanted to show the fact that I won't share any spoilers, but I wanted to focus on the fact that there were probably good intentions even on the panel of the officers. For instance, the brigadier from Kerala who presides over the court martial is an extremely sympathetic character. He wants to do the right thing. And then the reader can judge ultimately whether the right thing, the right outcome happens or not. But my point in showing this from different perspectives was to really make the point that it wasn't all, the evil world is out to get the Sikhs, whether it was during the violence, whether it was during the aftermath. We were in a lot of cases, extremely trapped by our circumstances and our prejudices. See, in the court martial, there is a reference to an army bulletin which talks about the fact that there's a dangerous class of Sikhs who are known as Amritdharis. Anybody who knows a little bit about Sikhs would find that absolutely amusing. But I have read multiple references to that. There was such a lack of understanding of who the Sikhs were at that time, within the army top brass, that the very fact that a Sikh was a part of the Khalsa Brotherhood and had taken Amrit was enough for them to be explicitly tagged as dangerous and potential terrorists. I mean, look at the extent of the ignorance. This is the kind of ignorance that fed into a lot of what happened during those days.
Which does connect me to the larger question, and smaller question of institutional memory, because isn't it ironic that the army should not have an institutional memory of Amritdharis? In some ways, the army has cultivated and feasted on that memory and built up the Sikh as a warrior and fostered that Amritdhari identity in some senses. And is it some sense of loss of memory which sort of epitomizes the country in some senses as we move on?
It does. And this is a complex issue that you've raised, and there's a lot to unpack. I mean, this whole trope of the heroic Sikh and the Sikhs and the Gurkhas as the best warriors on the planet, as we all know, came from the British. And while some of it may have been driven by genuine admiration, a lot of it was driven by them essentially exploiting the Sikhs and the Gurkhas for their colonial purposes. But the fact of the matter is that my research tells me that, ironically, the British had a much better understanding of the ethos of the Sikhs, who, essentially were the last to fall to the British Empire, than the modern Indian army. And it's shocking. It's really shocking. So that's a great observation.
And so again, in the same, when we had last spoken, I had mentioned in particular, the second short story in the book, The General. And I mean, just to lay the background to people who may not have read the book, it is about what happens in the years leading up to Blue Star in the diaspora in New York, especially the Gurdwara at Richmond Hill, which both of us in New York have encountered. And strangely enough, after our conversation, I had mentioned I've read the recent book by GBS Sidhu, a raw officer, special secretary to the government of India, who's got a recent book out. That's so much of what was common knowledge within the community, and as you said, was seen as conspiracy because we are working in a democracy with its freedoms and its openness, actually turns out to be true. This is what the Indian government was up to in the years leading up to it. So again, would you just elaborate on that book and some of the information there and your personal experiences and interactions with some of it?
Sure. So I'll talk briefly about The General. This is the only story in the book which is set outside of India. It's set in Massachusetts and New York. Now, remember, I was not in the US, in 84. I was in India, and I write about some of the events that occurred right after 1984, based mostly on eyewitness testimonies and conversations that I've had with people older than I who were present at that time. Now, I got to the New York area in 1987, which was not that many years after the events of 1984. So I have seen firsthand the anger within the expat Sikh community directed towards the Indian government, because it was still very, very fresh in 1987, when I got there. So that anger figures very prominently in this particular story. And it's also important to understand that this anger was mercilessly exploited at that time by people with very, very specific political agendas. A lot of money was raised. It's not clear even today where a lot of the money went. There were highly charismatic figures involved who were stoking an anti-India movement in the diaspora. And I will let the audience do its own research, but you can find any number of references that talk about the fact that there was a very insidious program to sort of, entice Sikhs to embrace militancy. And that sort of would result in tremendous propaganda gains in the press. I would urge you to do your own research about that, but that plays into the book very, very prominently. And, one of I don't want to give out any spoilers because many people have not read the book, but, the title character in the story, The General, is a very charismatic Sikh army officer who has retired from the army and shows up in New York saying that he has been handpicked by the late Janel Singh Bhindranwale to lead a resistance movement in the US. And then we learn what his real motivations are in the story. So I am actually delighted, Hartosh. I haven't had a chance to read GBS Sidhu's book yet, but I am delighted to hear that quote unquote insider accounts are now starting to emerge about those times, because surely they will inform us and help us understand what was going on with a lot more nuance than we do today, particularly those of us who, for whatever reason, are not motivated to go out and seek sources that are not completely in the mainstream.
I just want to round this off with two more questions. Actually, I want to keep talking, but I think we need to involve the audience. So two questions. One is this whole larger question as you draw in, and we saw it in the Night of the Restless Spirits in your reference to Marquez and the massacre that we were talking about, and Coulthard's Mime, which echoes events of a 1903 pogrom of Jews in Russia. That how much are you driven by this need to look at 84 in the context of other events, other tyrannies, other experiences of people across the world?
That's a great question, Hartosh. And it really goes deeply to sort of, how I view myself as a Sikh and how I understand the message of Guru Nanak. And let me explain what I mean by that. Caring about your own pain doesn't set you apart. The whole world cares about its own pain. It's no big deal. It's visceral, it's natural, all of us do it. I think that if you'll humor me for sounding foolishly optimistic for a second, I think that when each of us at an individual level is able to, quote, embrace the pain of the other, we actually make a strong contribution towards making the world a better place. I truly believe that. And my belief comes directly from the founder of the Sikh faith. When Nanak was returning from his Hajj, he was in a town called Sayyidpur, which is called Ahmedabad in modern day Pakistan, to visit one of his humble followers. And he encountered the warlord Babur, who had not yet established the Mughal Empire, who had laid Sayyidpur to waste. And there had been a huge massacre. There had been mass rapes. Multiple people had been imprisoned. Guru Nanak fearlessly confronted Babur, called him a tyrant to his face. And in fact, the things that he had to say to Babur have been documented in the Guru Granth Sahib, and in the Sikh context, they are collectively known as Babur Bani. Guru Nanak wasn't protesting about violence against quote unquote Sikhs. In his writings, he explicitly talks about the sufferings of Hindu women and Muslim women, of the high caste and the lowborn. In short, he was articulating the pain of everyone that he could see. And that to me is fundamentally important. When Meher Kaur, my daughter, and I were putting together Coulthard's Mime, the play, one of the things that we decided to do was to bookend text from Coulthard's Mime, the poem, with text from a very well-known poem by a Jewish writer, Chaim Bialik, who wrote about the 1903 Kishinev pogrom. The reason why we did that was, if you look at Bialik's poem in the City of Slaughter and you look at Coulthard's Mime, you will see startling similarities. Well, maybe not so startling, because both of these refer to a group of people who were set upon, murdered, attacked for no reason other than who they were. How is the pain of Kishinev any different from the pain of the Trans-Yamuna colonies where the Sikhs were massacred? How is it different from the pain of Godhra? How is it different from the pain of these thousands of instances of sectarian violence that we seem to be doomed to repeat over and over and over again? So this really is what animates me, looking at this pattern of violence that sort of seems to extend through human history, and really, really highlighting it, because it's a cautionary tale. And this is really our best assurance for making sure that the next Godhra or the next 1984 doesn't happen. That is a tremendously important part of my thinking, and it runs through the entire book. And thank you, Hartosh, for bringing that out.
And amazingly so, we today live in a country where, again, seems to be a certain deafness to the pain of others. In fact, a certain pleasure in inflicting it on others. But I wanted to wind up with, you brought up the reference to Sikhism, and I just wanted to connect this book to your other books. And I mean the one that you have already written, which is Joseph Harlan, The Camel Merchant in Ranjit Singh's Court, and the book you said you are writing, which I would want you to speak about a little and just place this in context, and then we'll throw up the question to the audience.
Sure. Very, very briefly. So my last book was The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia, which was set in the court of Ranjit Singh. And my next book is called The Story of the Sikhs. It takes its name from a podcast of the same title that I started a couple of years ago. My motivation in doing the podcast was to write a very personal or present a very personal take on the Sikh faith. Because remember, I'm the fellow who left India with no underpinnings and in a certain sense found my roots in the diaspora. Through a long struggle, I couldn't read Gurmukhi at that time, so I could only read things in translation. Subsequently, as I started teaching young Sikh children in the diaspora, I started embracing, obviously taught myself Gurmukhi, started reading the Guru Granth Sahib, and a host of medieval literature that's mostly in Braj Bhasha that is lost to modern generations. The result of that is this podcast, 2 seasons of which are available right now, and which, thankfully has been very well received. So this is being published in book form in roughly about a year's time. And it really attempts to tell the story of the Sikhs from a storyteller's perspective, as opposed to from a historian's perspective. And then I use a lot of the Braj poetry to provide color to the narrative. The story of the gurus, and speaking as a Sikh, and possibly this extends to non-Sikhs as well. All of us know quite a bit about Guru Nanak. We know quite a bit about Guru Gobind Singh. We know a tiny bit about Guru Arjan, and that's kind of where things fall apart. Beyond that, we know very little of the history of the Sikh gurus. So this work attempts to bring to light the lives of some of the other gurus and some of the very interesting things that happened in their lifetimes. So this is being published in about a year or so. My Sikh identity is important to me, but I don't see myself as a quote unquote Sikh writer, even though, some of my work has very much been informed by Sikh history. But I can tell you that no matter what I work on, one of my future projects is a book on the life of the Sufi Shah Hussain, which draws heavily upon his kafis. All of this I very much approach from the Sikh ethos, because that's who I am.
Thank you. Preet. It's been a pleasure. I will turn to the audience. Just maybe read out 1 or 2 comments that are already on the chat, which connect up. I think Gurubdesh here has said, besides Who Are the Guilty, there were also 2 other magazines, Surya India and Probe India, that catalogued in details the story of 84. I think it's important to note that. And I think we may have already addressed this comment, but I think it's worth reading it out. Artika Bakshi, Mr. Singh, this session is very interesting. I haven't read your book, but I thought this session would be like so many others that I have attended, where 84 is looked at as a singular event in history. I find that flawed, as we need to view it as a whole, connected to events and scenarios that happened much earlier. Very impressed that you've used magical realism to tell the stories. I hope people read the book to understand the depth of emotions like a literary piece and not like a historical narrative. Look forward to reading it. Okay, and I'll just move.
And thank you for that. Whoever made that observation, I really appreciate that.
In terms of questions, the first one here is Sukhdev Singh Sohal. Do you think with time passing, more skeletons would tumble out of military and intelligence cupboards?
For sure. Absolutely. Unequivocally, yes. Because the skeletons are there and they need to come out, and they will come out. Murder will out, as the bard said.
Okay, I Not sure either you or I are the right person to address this, but I'll just read out the next question. Uh, Maybe I'll just frame it in a context where we can address it, kind of an off-track question from Himatveer Singh. What I wanted to know, what post-84 events led to the establishment of the Khalistan embassy in Ecuador, and what is its status right now? Maybe you can use this to maybe address the larger idea of Khalistan in the diaspora, and maybe what you see of it now.
Sure. So I have actually a great interest in learning more about the Khalistan movement and writing about it. It's a fascinating topic with, multiple things. Unfortunately, I can't call myself an expert by any stretch of the imagination. And I have to confess that I didn't know about the Ecuadorian embassy. I'm wondering if it is similar to the Ecuadorian island of Kalasha, which I forget the name of the garden. I'm being tongue in cheek over here, but I'll answer that question best as I can. First of all, and I'm sure the questioner did not intend to do this, but I find the conflating of 1984 and the pogrom with Khalistan to be deeply, deeply offensive. And I'll tell you why. There's tremendous angst in some circles about Sikhs talking about 1984. And, I think the audience has been polite and nobody has raised this, but I've experienced this for sure. And I have to tell you that, well, first of all, let me clarify in case anyone is curious. I have no truck with Khalistan and never have had, and have, never been a supporter and never will be. But I do want to say that it's a travesty when anyone who raises a voice against the massacre of innocents even gets a question about Khalistan. We performed Kultar's Mime at Harvard, and I think a well-intentioned member of the audience got up and said, this is terrible, this shouldn't have happened, but would you care to comment about all the news that we get about Khalistan these days being active again? This was right around the time when Harjit Singh Sajjan had visited India, and there was a nothing burger of him being an extremist that was circulating in Indian media. So what I'm trying to say is that talking about 1984 should not be a Sikh issue. Talking about 1984 is an Indian issue. Why? Because only by confronting such ugly chapters of our history that don't appear in history books can we make the country a better place. I think that every 1984 should be talked about. Godhra should be talked about. Every instance of sectarian violence, doesn't matter who's being targeted, should be talked about, absolutely and unequivocally.
In fact, I think I'm glad you said that, because whether we like it or not, we are in a particular stage in this country of partisanship where this kind of labeling is almost impossible to escape. Each time I'm critical of the current government, the label of Khalistani gets affixed even to somebody like me, leave alone somebody living outside the country. And that is simply a question of reducing everybody to their most basic identity, whatever they represent or don't represent. And it's a trap, I think, that's getting increasingly difficult to escape from, because when the world is polarized and people are seeing it either as for us against it, however much one may protest, this is how people end up identifying them. I will just return to some of the questions here. One or two questions are about people wanting to contact you. Is it okay, or could they mail Preeti or Majha House to get an email address?
I'm really easy to find. Okay. So, my Twitter handle is @Sarpreet Singh. That's probably the easiest way to contact me, and we can take it from there.
Okay. And I think one or two of the questions address this in terms of the amount of material, stories that have been generated that you would have encountered in the writing of this book. Is there more you are thinking of doing, more you're thinking of writing around 84? Is it something that you'll return to?
Who knows? A writer's life is exciting. you're like a kid in a candy shop because there is so much that you could be writing about. I actually have 2 or 3 projects that are very dear to my heart. I would like to write about the turbulence in Punjab leading up to 1984 for a number of reasons. One of them is that this is the time that is not well studied. Of course, you find reams and reams of information, but the information that you get is very slanted along one particular agenda or driven by one particular agenda or the other. So I have a great interest in approaching the period before 1984, again, in the realm of fiction. And I've actually started collecting materials to do a little bit of the research, but I probably have 3 other books to write before I'm going to get to that. Short stories of a similar nature. Every day I get ideas, not just about the targeting of Sikhs, but I can tell you that the unfortunate targeting and painting of Muslims in India in today's sort of, today's time of heightened chauvinism, unfortunately provides you with more material than you ever wanted to have. And then it's poignant to read some of the news articles about what's happening. I was in India 7 or 8 months ago, and I had informal conversation. If you remember, the Shaheen Bagh agitation was just sort of getting to a crescendo at that point, and it was talked about in press. And I was startled to see the reaction of non-Muslims to that. People that I knew who were decent to their core, who could never hurt a fly, when I saw the amount of hatred and suspicion in those people based on what they had been reading on the media and what they'd been seeing on social media, I was scared. I was absolutely petrified because my eyes showed me a 1984 right there. Strangely, COVID, the pandemic happened at that time, and that particular agitation dissipated sort of organically because of these reasons, and all of that receded to the background. But in all the things that I read in those times, there are thousands of poignant stories that are waiting to be told. Unfortunately, this is the nature of the world that we live in.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're right to draw that comparison because the violence that subsequently happened in Northeast Delhi, very similar demographic profile of the victims to 84, the same behavior of the authorities and police, the same ideological targeting. I mean, in some ways, you're right. I mean, Shaheen Bagh was always a precursor and indicator of where this country was heading, and we saw that play out. In this context, there's a question here from Nikita. We often talk about how the victims and survivors of 84 never got any justice. How would you define justice in this context? What would constitute justice?
That's a very difficult question to answer. And I can tell you that in the 90 talkbacks that we had after Kultar's Mime, the play, this question appeared almost every time. What is justice in this particular case? I don't know. Accountability is tremendously important, but some of the perpetrators have already died natural deaths because, this happened 36 years ago, and some of the others will also. People have asked me about forgiveness, healing. We've talked about the Truth and Reconciliation, in South Africa, post-apartheid, and so on. There are a few things that we know for sure. Revenge is not the way to go. I mean, I'm stating the obvious here, but let me state it from my Sikh ethos. Revenge is as alien to the Sikh ethos as the fight for justice and the fight against injustice is relevant to it or is part and parcel to it. There is no place in the Sikh ethos for revenge, and we just have to turn to the life of Guru Gobind Singh to understand that. Fighting for justice, however, is an integral part of the Sikh ethos, which goes all the way back to Guru Nanak's Babar Bani. It's incumbent on Sikhs, I feel, to talk about justice for 1984, and not just 1984, but every 1984 that's happened since or is likely to happen. What would I like to see? I would certainly love to see the guilty brought to justice. Who they are is very clear. You just have to go and read the unimpeachable sources that exist out there. I am a big fan of the notion of forgiveness. We will not be able to move on until we reconcile and forgive. But there's a practical problem. In order to forgive, there has to be someone to forgive. In the 36 years that have passed, the narrative has been, oh, it was a riot. It was a spontaneous disturbance. There is no acknowledgement of what had happened. I can tell you that the worldview of Guru Nanak is so broad that if tomorrow there is acknowledgement of what had happened, the Sikhs will most likely respond with forgiveness. But I haven't seen anybody raising their hand so far and saying, you know what? I was involved in something terrible. Please forgive me. Instead, what we've heard is, oh, we've been besmirched. This is nonsense. This is garbage. So, what is justice? I don't know. To me, justice, the biggest, greatest form of justice would be some measure of peace for those who survived. I have been to Tilak Vihar. I went there against my better judgment for a number of reasons. The survivors of Tilak Vihar do not need to be reminded about 1984. They live 1984 every day. It is evident in their shattered lives. It is evident when you look at the next generation, the children of 1984, who have been devastated by drugs, alcohol, and poverty. The third generation is now at risk. To me, there would be some measure of justice if we were able to do something for the survivors, who live in abject conditions in Tilak Vihar today. A reckoning is tremendously important. What sort of form that reckoning should take, I don't have answers for. What I can say, though, is each one of us has a responsibility and each one of us has an opportunity to do something. I go back to my daughter, who was, I think, a 16 or 17-year-old at that time. And she tells me that, when she was growing up and going to Sikh camps and so on, she would often be asked the question, what are you going to do about it? And that's an intimidating question for an adult, much less for a child. But you know what she did? She went and created this play that was seen by 18,000 people in 6 countries and actually impacted lives. All of us have the opportunity to make an impact in our immediate context. I think that if we are to take anything from the suffering of the innocents of whichever 84 that we are talking about, the one thing that we can do is, if we see any of this nonsense happening around us at any level, let's not look the other way. That's something that each of us can do.
In this context, and there are again a few more questions, but I just wanted to bring in a question of my own, which is also in a larger context, the responsibility as a writer when one writes about subjects like this. I mean, for instance, I wrote in detail in 2015 on, again, the violence that followed in November, what the Congress did, how this was organized. One of the things I realized is that talking to the people who have survived the violence, to get them to tell testimonies that they've related 50 times over is actually problematic. And it creates an expectation of hope that something will come out of this retelling, which actually does not happen. I took resort to actually going through the thousands of affidavits which had been filed before the commission and had never really been mined and still haven't been, to some extent been mine, like you know. But in the larger context, as a fiction writer, and these are discussions I've had, I hope you will meet him, or at some point, Jaspreet Singh, again, an engineer who's the author of the book Helium on 80,
Yeah, I've met him.
who has tried in fiction, and this is a question that has come up before, whether people write about the Holocaust or events which deal with reality and then try to fictionalize them. What are the responsibilities that come up with taking on a subject like
That's an excellent question, because fiction certainly has the infinite ability to inflame emotions, and when you are writing about topics like these, you have to be extremely nuanced and you have to be extremely sensitive while not sugarcoating anything or whitewashing anything. So I can only speak for myself. I take this responsibility very, very seriously. I'll share something deeply personal with you. Once I started learning about 1984, in my mid 20s, and then learning for real, I remember feeling a tremendous amount of anger, understandably. Now, a lot of young Sikhs who were born in the diaspora after 1984 tend to view everything associated with India through the exclusive lens of 1984, which I feel is terrible. And the reason for that is, even today, with my gray beard, I often feel a tremendous amount of anger at what had happened. But my anger is balanced by the fact that I grew up in the Indian context. I know that the vast majority of people in India are normal, decent people whose humanity is completely intact and was never touched by the terrible events of 1984. For those who don't have the benefit of that grounding in particular, it's really, really important that these stories be told with nuance. I remember at our Stanford performance of Gultar's Mine, we had 350 people in the audience. It was a very emotional performance. The audience was very engaged. A young woman got up. She was not sick. She must have been in her 30s, early 30s. So she stood up in the audience in the talkback and said, "I'm really sorry that the Sikhs were attacked by Hindus in 1984 in Delhi." I was shocked. And my response was, no, don't say that, because that's not the truth. The Sikhs were not attacked by the majority community or any community in 1984. The Sikhs were attacked by a very specific political interest that was trying to further its, that was going after political gains. So the point that I'm trying to make is that it's very easy for us to go down the slippery slope of, hatred, revenge, when we talk about difficult issues like these. And it's really anybody who's involved with telling these stories, it is their absolute responsibility to make sure that if they ever get that sort of a reaction from their audience, they call it out immediately and very, very unequivocally. In my case, the intent of my work is very, very clear. But to your point, Hartosh, it may not be clear to everybody who reads it. So it's my job to make sure that it's never taken out of context. You obviously try to do that through your writing by writing in a nuanced manner, but then conversations like these in today's world also provide a stellar opportunity to do that.
Yet there are, and I will just read out something which may be difficult. It could be a little simplistic, but there is certain point. I think Harbaksh Singh here writes that every pogrom in India is an issue of the Indian state, as the victims tend to be different, but the perpetrators are always the same. The state is a manifestation of Brahmanism or a few upper castes and people who share their view. And the same section is still perpetrating violence or genocides today as we speak. That there is a certain systematic setup, even if we don't go into the specifics, which repeats itself, whether it is 84 or today. And in that sense, to what extent do we go in articulating and calling out this truth?
I think that it's important, tremendously important, to articulate this truth. This question is very much above my pay grade because, this is not my space and not my field. But, without sort of specifically pointing fingers, it is absolutely true. And by the way, I will add one more thing. The state bears a huge responsibility when it turns to repression, because a crazy person with a gun can be called a terrorist and can be shot down in the street, and nobody is going to lose much sleep over that. But when the state sends in commandos with light machine guns who can line up people in front of a wall and shoot them in cold blood, what are you going to do? The state does bear tremendous responsibility. The problem is there is so much demagoguery in the world today, whether you look at the US or whether you look at India, and it's so insidious and so effective. Forget about the lunatic fringe. When decent human beings get so influenced by this sectarian demagoguery that they are willing to condone terrible acts of violence against the minority, we know that we have hit an inflection point. How do we roll that back? I don't know. I honestly don't know. But recognizing it and calling it out is definitely something that all of us can do, and we should. So kudos to the person who raised this particular issue.
And I just wanted to wind up by bringing it back to Sarpreet, the writer. And so again, the first book, Camel Merchants, was nonfiction, deeply researched in some senses. This is fictionalization of historic events. You are going back. The Gurbani, how do you keep apart, and what distinction do you see between your fiction and nonfiction? And is there a distinction that separates it in your mind?
Oh gosh, that's a tough question. Maybe I'm a very non-self-aware writer. And I just go where my fancy takes me. But on a more serious note, I don't think I approach my fiction any differently from how I approach my nonfiction. In particular, when I talk about the nonfiction that I write, I always wear a storyteller's hat. The history of Ranjit Singh, or actually it's not the history of Ranjit Singh, it's the story of people who surrounded him in his court, is deeply researched, but it is absolutely and unequivocally written from a storyteller's perspective, as is the upcoming story of the Sikhs. My very conscious attempt is to try and engage the audience and make very, very difficult material accessible. And I'm hopeful that my audience will see that and will engage with my nonfiction work as storytelling and not history. But I definitely see a thread that runs through both. And I don't have a very different process when I'm working on one versus the other.
Thank you, Sarpreet. Preeti, we'll just hand over to you. It's just been wonderful. I don't know, with a subject like this, as I said, it's difficult to use the right adjective, but thank you again.
Thanks very much, Hartosh, and thank you, Sarpreet. I mean, I've just finished writing that you've actually taken the conversation into the book and then out of the book and into the realms of this country and the world and what's been happening, and brought it right back to where we are today. Thank you very much for such a far-reaching, freewheeling, fabulous discussion today. I read this little bit yesterday, but I have to read it again because this, I think, is what it's a lot of what you said, because it's memory and the way we remember things which matters, and what we should be left with at the end, I think, also. This is a little piece that I had written in an anthology about 84. So I think everybody has a story about that time if you lived in a city that went through that kind of turmoil. When I remember those days after so many decades, I wonder about the kind of lessons I have learned, along with the mistrust, insecurity, despair, and anger, there is now a new understanding, as well as an empathy and sensitivity for those who are in a minority or on the periphery or dispossessed and discriminated against or still waiting for justice and closure. Much of the work that I choose to do now, and this refers to some of the work I was doing when I was still working with the publishing house, and a lot of the other work I did in the Northeast, in Nagaland, Mizoram, Assam, etc. A lot of the work that I do is an engagement with people who have not been heard, whose voices are still crying out. Um, and it is to challenge an unfair, unseeing, unjust system that continues to deny people a life of dignity and pride. Perhaps it took the experience of 1984 to bring this home to me, as it must have done for so many others. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to ask Arvinder ji to please, I think he has a story he wants to share with all of us, and then to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti ji. I think probably we can share. I can share my story some of the time, because I'm living each moment which I experienced it myself in 1984 when I was in Delhi, and I lost my about 7 relatives across India. Most of them were in Kanpur and of course in Delhi, and I still see those families, going through that pain and trauma. You know, though they have the third generation now, but then you can still see that pain on the faces of the third generation even. And I must compliment you, sir, Sarabreji and Hatoshi. You did a very wonderful job, in recollecting everything. And let me share what you pointed out, Sarabji, that you wish to go, prior to the 84. Let me share the two personal, feelings of mine. When the trouble started, that was 13th of April, 1978, when the Narankaris shot down 13 Sikhs. Out of those 13, one was my Tayaji, my father's elder brother, Yani Hari Singh. He was the first one to have the bullet on his chest. And then 1984, when the Operation Blue Star took place at Golden Temple, my other Tayaji, my father's another brother, we lost him to the LMG burst. He was standing on the terrace of his house, and when the burst, just pulled him down. And I think probably each one of us has seen. I was 15. I think probably we will start crying. But as you said, that forgiveness is always the basic essence of the philosophy of Sikhism, and that this is what Guru Nanak preached. But at the same time, Guru Gobind Singh said somewhere that you are to rise against injustice. You just cannot let it go like that. And he says that "Chunka ajahma hilte dar gujash halal ast burdan bashimshir dast." So though you are to protect your surroundings, but at the same time you need the kind of energy you need. And in the last 40, 50 years, we have diluted the basic essence of Sikhism. And this needs to be, uh, you know, uh, this needs to be questioned to ourselves, that we are responsible for it. Too much of it, we are also responsible for the, we have diluted the spirit, the basic spirit of the Sikhism. But anyways, thanks to Penguin Random House for partnering with the Majha House, and of course, thanks to Hatoshi. It's always an honor to have you, and we would like to have your books. I think probably the book should be available on the Amazon, PTG.
Anji, if you will put up, if she's just sent the, if you will put that up, I've sent it to you.
All right.
If you will share it with the audience.
Yeah, I will definitely share it with the audience, and
you can order it on Amazon or from Penguin Random House.
All right. So I think probably each one of the participants now, they can order the book on the Amazon, on the Penguin Random House. So thanks once again. Thank you so very much indeed. Always an honor for the Majha House to have such souls. And these 2 days, yesterday and today, I think we have lived again, those few days of 1984 post, uh, murder of the former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Thank you once again. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you so much. It was absolutely a pleasure. And again, Preeti ji, thank you so much for organizing this. And Hartosh, what a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just sharing that link in the chat box, so you can order it. Just a second, Preeti ji, just a second. I'm just sharing that link. Then I would take leave. Right, sir. Right, sir. Goodbye from India. Thank you.